But Megyn, I think we've got you back now. Apologies for that. But you were just talking about the fact that you were actually practicing law in Chicago on 9/11.
Yeah. And it was a situation where I had just moved from Lower Manhattan, from just steps away. I lived next to Trinity Church, which is right behind the World Trade Center where it used to be. And I knew that building, those two towers intimately. I'd eaten there, I'd shopped there. I remember sitting there reading the Bill Clinton Ken Starr report on the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal, cover to cover, in the Barnes and Noble inside those buildings. And my first thought was for all the deli owners who I knew, all the guys who, you get coffee from in the morning. And it was surreal. It was impossible to believe. It was just impossible to believe. And, on another note, Dan, I remember watching the journalists that day and just what heroic work they did in maintaining their composure, reporting on the most horrific thing any of them had seen, most likely in their lifetimes. And it was one of the reasons why I left the law and got into journalism, because I felt back then that it was a public service that those people performed that day. Ashley Banfield, who I'm still a fan of, she was magnificent and really just inspired me to try to get out there and help people, right? Get information in during the tough days. And it's one of the things I'm reflecting on now as we're at the 20th year anniversary, the loss of life, the loss of treasure, what's happened to our country in terms of big government and terrorist threats and political divisiveness, which we weren't feeling in the days after that horrific event, but also what's happened to our American media and how differently I feel about it now, 20 years later.
That was the thing, because on that day, Megyn, we obviously all tuned into the US media all around the world, and there was trust and there was unity, and it doesn't feel like we're there now. For me, I'll tell you my story quickly, because it's quite crazy, because I was in New Zealand, and because of the time difference, the attacks took place overnight, and it was when we still relied much more on the printed press. And it was literally one of those moments of waking up the next morning and your life changing. I remember my mum, because I was 18 years old, I was at university, still living at home. My mum walked into my bedroom, and the late edition of our local newspaper there just had the front page headline, "America Under Attack," with a picture of the plane flying into the tower. And literally, I felt like my life changed. It was like an innocent first 18 years. And then I grew up and became an adult in the era of terror. I was on the Tube network in London for the 7/7 bombings, which were, of course, as close as we've come in this country to 9/11. And I really felt like that day represents my innocence lost.
You know what, Dan? In a weird way, I feel like listening to you talk, it might explain why you and I wound up in the place we did as journalists and people who push back against some of these cultural complaints that seem so petty these days in cancel culture. It's like, if you lived through 9/11, if you watched our country go through this year, and I remember the 7/7 attacks, I covered those as a journalist too, it just gives you a sense of perspective on what really matters and what is an actual threat and what is worth one's agitation and upset and what isn't, and how, when given the choice between leaning toward one another or leaning apart and being awful to one another, choose leaning together, right? And it's just, I think about it all the time. I feel like we're getting complacent. We're forgetting what real threats look like and what real danger is when we talk about words being dangerous to us. It's like, stop it. We're not that far away from these horrific moments that we can take our eye off that ball, right?
Completely agree. And actually later on in the show, we're actually talking about that very point. Have we forgotten the emotional impact of that day and the way that we needed to change? And I think you're right. And actually, that's why we need to talk about Afghanistan, because it has come into close focus over the past 2 weeks. And there is this horrible irony, Megyn, that the 20th anniversary in Afghanistan is going to be marked with the Taliban back in full control.
Yep. And it didn't have to happen. It's such a tragedy. Afghanistan from beginning to end has been so fraught with peril and problems. And, we got bin Laden, which was an amazing feat, and our guys kept us safe. And your guys too, right? Guys and gals over there fighting, keeping our country safe, fighting the terrorists over there instead of at home. And that's worth something. You know, these Afghanistan veterans now who are wondering what was it all for as the Taliban's back in control and executing innocents in the street, no matter what the PR spin is now. It was worth something. It was worth a lot. It kept our countries safe from massive terror attacks for decades. And we got bin Laden and we got a lot of his top lieutenants, and Al-Qaeda was decimated. So it wasn't all for naught. But the victories, we could have held on. There was no reason to pull all those troops out. And yes, Trump was the one to say we should do it, but Biden's the one who actually did it. And so he's the one we're holding accountable. There was no reason to pull out all those troops and give up the gains. And there's no question now. Even our own chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, was out there this week saying, yeah, I predict there's very likely chance that we're going to see terror attacks back here on the homeland between 12 and 36 months. What? I mean, we know, but why? Why so cavalier about it? It didn't have to happen. Why did you give up the gains? Why did you give back the country to the Taliban, the friends of Al-Qaeda? Of course, I'm not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but even I can see that coming. And it wasn't necessary. And that's without even discussing what happened to our 13 Marines and the hundreds of Afghans who were there and the disgrace that we've brought upon ourselves as a nation.
Well, I was watching an incredible BBC documentary, Megyn, which actually features President Bush, George W. Bush, and his top team recounting what happened for them on that day and what was going through their mind. And actually, Bush got such a tough time in the media, especially the British media, throughout all of that time. He was covered very differently here to how he was in the US. But actually, I think there has been a real understanding now in the UK that Bush showed true leadership on that day and in the weeks and months after. Of course, very many people disagree with his stance on the Iraq war. But looking at Bush explaining his sense of leadership on that day and comparing him to Biden at the height of this crisis, my goodness, you just think, actually, they're on different planets, Megyn.
There is no comparison. I mean, no one can forget George Bush looking at us and saying freedom itself was attacked today and freedom will be defended. And taking that megaphone in front of the fallen towers and the rubble and the remains of nearly 3,000 Americans and promising that he would come back and that he would get the bad guys, that they would answer for what they had done, and he did it. Joe Biden can't read anything that's not on a teleprompter, Dan. He doesn't have it in him to inspire that way. I mean, he's in the news this week and has been, I think, fairly criticized for when he met with the families of the fallen 13 Marines, talking about his own loss. This is not to diminish the loss of his son, Beau. I interviewed Joe Biden and his wife, Jill, on my show at NBC, and I've got nothing but empathy for him and his loss. But there's a time and a place for it. I think George W. Bush understood that, and prior leaders in America have understood that, from Abe Lincoln to FDR, in dealing with Gold Star families who have actually lost blood and treasure thanks to your order as commander-in-chief. Now's not the time to make it about you or to try to gin up empathy for you, especially because it was his order that led to their deaths ultimately, right? He's the one who put them in harm's way. They volunteered for the job, but it's not the same as two parents having a random conversation at a dinner. He's not behaving appropriately. His decisions have been off. He refuses to face the press corps and take hard questions. And when you ask him, he runs and tries to switch the subject. He won't have a primetime press conference. And there's real questions about whether, is it because he doesn't have his mental faculties past 4 p.m, which is the only time he appears willing to talk to us. He's nothing like George W. Bush. And that, as you point out, is not to excuse what happened in Iraq and what happened in the days thereafter 9/11. But I was looking back, George W. Bush's approval rating here in America after 9/11 was in the 90s. It hasn't happened ever since.
Probably never will again. Megyn Kelly, thank you so much for reflecting today on what will be a very sad anniversary. And of course, your podcast, Megyn, the Megyn Kelly Show, available to download. And I did listen actually to your interview with Caitlyn Jenner last night. Absolutely fascinating. So I really recommend that people check that out. Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.